Construction companies don't fail because of lack of software. They fail because of broken processes. In this episode, Emanuel Falaguerra explains why WIP, ERP migrations, and AI only work when ownership, process, and financial truth are aligned first. Welcome to Finance at the Jobsite, the podcast where construction finance meets the field. I'm your host, Rishi Srivastava, founder of Being Human. In each episode, I sit down with construction CFOs, controllers, owners, project managers, IT leaders, ERP consultants, and industry experts to uncover how they connect the back office with the field, choose and implement technology, manage cash flow, and drive profitable projects. Whether you are running the numbers, leading the team, or designing the systems that keep projects moving, this is your place to learn what's working, what's broken, and what's next in construction finance. Today, our guest is Emanuel Falaguerra. Emanuel, welcome.
Thank you, Rishi. Great to be here.
First section is on your background and perspective. You've been in construction tech for 20 plus years. What's one thing about the industry that hasn't changed despite all the new software?
Yeah, so software has definitely gotten to be plentiful, and there's still an amount of interpretation that has to be done that software doesn't quite always handle. So you still need to know how much of the job is left, what are the costs, where are we in the process, and things like that. And that doesn't necessarily come from a product. That's really the interpretation of your team that's coming up with that.
Yeah. I was talking to an owner and she was telling that anytime there is a law, the agencies, they write the interpretation and she has to do interpretation of interpretation.
And that's tough enough.
You've seen the evolution from early systems to modern SaaS. Has construction actually gotten more efficient or just more complex?
There's been pockets where they've gained some efficiencies, but for the most part, the construction industry has kind of lagged behind in adopting technology and getting it to really work for them. Yeah, the work has gotten complex, that's for sure. But there's a lot of tools out there now in this arc, since then to kind of meet that demand. But it's about preparation before you get to the product. Before you pick a system, probably good to go and look at what your process is and how is that going to work with the system you have, or how will that system support you in that.
Agriculture is the only industry that is behind in tech adoption
It is.
compared to
Yeah.
construction.
Yeah, it's pretty far. It's far behind. There's a gap between construction when you get into other like finance industry and manufacturing, and they've really done a lot with technology. But yeah, construction seems to struggle with that a little bit.
Yeah. You choose to stay in construction instead of moving into more quote unquote modern tech sectors. What keeps you here?
I saw the need, in the early days, the gaps from the systems that were there and the lack of preparation. Construction was kind of trying to figure out what to do with technology. How did it fit? In those early days, there was a lot of opportunity to build interfaces. That's a lot of the work that I had. There's still that, there's still some of that because not every system or systems are going to fix everything. So there's always going to be gaps somewhere. The important part is to identify those and then try and find a way to make them in the process more solid.
Yeah. Even someone like me, I was an AI engineer at Bank of America until 2022. And I was like, which industry should I go to where this technology needs to be implemented? And I was like, yeah, construction sounds like the right fit.
Yeah, right. And I think, not for them not trying, they really haven't had the opportunity to benefit from what technology can do. That's the big opportunity that exists for construction, in my opinion.
No, and the market is very fragmented too. A bunch of private equity led software companies are leading the charge. And one complaint I have against private equity led companies is that they don't like to innovate. They just like to keep making their consistent revenues.
Yeah, right. They're not concerned about whether the product is the right fit or whether or not that they've done their due diligence to make sure that the company's using it right and properly. They want to get their money and run, basically.
Yeah, and milk the cow for as long as you can. Don't try to invent anything. There's so many companies they're like sitting on like software packages from 1990s.
Yeah.
It was kind of insane.
It is, yeah. Well, I get there is a lot of that in the industry in the construction, but they're starting to make that change, going from those client server products, some of the older ones that have been out there like Sage and whatnot. And that's a big lift for them, to take all that they built all of those years and now bring that into, SAS or, cloud service. That's quite a bit of work. So, but they're getting there. Sage got intact and whatnot. So the technology is definitely advancing very well. That's
Yeah,
sure.
even though they have the newer product, it's like how do we move these companies, these construction companies, from this old product like Sage 100 to newer stuff, let's say Acumatica. It's
Right.
like that transition itself is a nightmare for these companies.
Yeah. Oh, and the one of the problems too, if they were able to first step back, take a look at the process, what's going
Hmm.
on with the current system, right? That where doesn't it work for us? Where are the gaps? Where are the holes? Who owns this? Who's taking care of that? But they go and they read the feature list or they're presented a feature list of a product and like, yeah, we need it to do this, that, and that, but then they don't come to the table with this is our
Hmm.
process. How does that actually work in reality, in the real world? That's where I've seen people get kind of tripped up, and then you're scrambling to go back and, you know, fix that gap or, optimize the software to make it a little bit better.
Yeah, yeah. Also, with this, the sales-driven nature of this industry, it's like salespeople, they're out there just to sell something quick and walk out of the door. And when it comes to implementation, it's like, did we really sell that?
And they don't want to pick up the phone and take the call and be like, "This isn't doing what you said it would do," or whatever. They're just going to move on to the next. That
Exactly. So I think that the differentiation, I like the split between sales and delivery, is kind of a big problem as well.
Yeah, I agree. They're not helping. Let's put it that way. They aren't really helping the situation. I think there's an opportunity for a sales organization to build a strong relationship with a company if they help that company do their due diligence to really get the most out of the system. There's
Hmm.
expectations. I think that some companies, in my experience, when I've done implementations in the earlier times, they really just were expecting that the software is going to fix the problem, and all they
Hmm.
need to do is implement it. And then there's a bunch of reality that comes into play, like, oh, I gotta have all these meetings and give all this process up about how it's going to work. So then you're chasing those people to get their time when they don't already have the time. They're so busy, right? Everybody's
Yeah.
got so much to do. So that's one thing I encountered a lot is the focus of the companies when they're implementing these systems. They're really just tell me what to do instead of here's what I need it to do. Here's how I need it to function. And then get that validation from the vendor, that, okay, we can definitely handle it, or here's how we handle it. Is that okay? If it doesn't work that way, then either another product or this is a sidebar that we're going to fix that gap with some other solution. Not everything is a software solution. Sometimes there's a manual process
Yeah.
going to happen. As long as everybody knows what it is and whoever owns it does it, they all play a very important role. It isn't just the software. The software by itself really doesn't do anything. It's about how you design it and then how you use it and how you fit it into your organization.
Very well said. The next section is the core problem, chaos and implementation. You described the industry as quote unquote chaotic with too many tools. What does that chaos actually look like inside a typical contractor?
Yeah, and chaos to me was that I would see working with a client, I'm there to solve one problem, then hear about we got this. An example would be a PM initiating on their own getting like a toolbox talk app or some kind of field app that they're going to use. So there's no discussion about how that fits in the process, what that person is doing with the information. So it's the beginning of a silo. It's a fragment. And nowadays, like you're saying about how the vendors are very eager to sell their new tools and products, then the grab is, oh, look what this can do. And right away they're going and they're going to purchase that. And now the CFO is looking at the subscription, dollars every month. It's like, what are all these? software tools we're dealing with. So, that is a kind of chaos, but it really is an indicator that you have another problem. And that means your communication and your process hasn't been well defined. And you don't really know yet how to integrate that with the tools that will make you do better. It isn't just buy whatever and then see how to make it work. It's what do we need it to do? What is the best product to make that happen?
Yeah. Yeah. Construction, you look at the field, it's like complete chaos. But the software world or office world doesn't have to be as chaotic.
Agree. I agree. It could definitely run more smoothly. I see that over and over again with the clients I work with. That it's an innocent kind of way that it evolves into that. People come in, they inherit what's already there for a process. No one's really questioning it. So they just proceed that way. And then just things get to a point where they're like, okay, what's the mess we have now? Maybe we need new software to fix these problems. And then they take that problem and they move it into a whole new system and then carry it forward.
Yeah. Why do so many construction companies buy software but fail to fully implement it?
Yeah, that goes back to the idea that they think that it's about the features first before their process. And once they, in it kind of where the failure happens, it's not even in the implementation. It happens before they even start because they haven't defined their process. And, really that's time and again, and the numbers still bear this out in the 30 years that I've been doing software this time frame. You're still looking at a 55 to 75% unsuccessful or failure rate in
Mhm.
meeting the objectives of the system, and that's stunning to me in all
Yeah.
these years, and that hasn't changed. But it's so funny. The simple little fix to that, or one of them, is to really get a good solid process baked before you start implementing software tools.
Yesterday, I had a first customer meeting with a prospect, and I was trying to understand their process and their systems. And I spent like 45 minutes. And at the end of the discussion, the owner tells me, I thought you were going to give me a demo at minute one. I was like, man, I'm trying to understand your process and show you what makes sense.
That's oh, yeah. That's so right. I had the same thing. They looked at me. It's like they thought you were going to give us a demo. I'm like, no, I got to know what you need first.
Yeah.
That's spot on. That's definitely you see a lot of that.
Kind of expectation is kind of backwards, right? I mean, your system, your processes, you've been doing it for 10 years and you want this new software to kind of give you a demo that's kind of going to be changing everything in your uh, process or organization,
Hmm.
even though I, as the person who's going to demo this product, I don't even know your process.
Yeah, right. Right. So going to show, and that's it. That is that whole feature thing. That's well, show me the features. What does it do? And then that is where it all goes and falls apart right from there.
Yeah. What do most companies get wrong when evaluating new technology?
Think kind of hit on that they're leading with features and not their process. And in fact, going back to what I said too, is sometimes they get to a point with the system or their processes that are so dysfunctional or disjointed that they think it's another system that's going to fix the problem. A lot of times, if you go back to your figure out your process and design that piece, look at the systems you currently have. How can they be optimized to work that way? You may not have to go through a whole disruption of getting a new system. You might just, what you have might be good enough. Because even if you've upgraded to something new, right? If you're talking about the older systems, it's better to probably move into something more current. But if you are in a more current system and you're still having problems, it's really more important, in my opinion, before you start shopping around for something else, is take a good hard look at your process and then find ways. Talk to the vendor. They have plenty of consultants that can probably help you optimize what you're currently doing and get better results.
Yeah. Actually, in the same call where I was talking about their process, at the end of it, it came out that they needed a stronger integration between their PM and accounting system. I mean, I ended up recommending a bunch of things that our product doesn't even do. Hey, you got to figure out like which field you're connecting this Procore with in your accounting system. It's not the unapproved, it's the transaction entry field that you need to connect.
Yeah. and the consistency of that information flowing, and seeing that trip up companies too. There's no communication about when the order should get into Procore. When is that interface going to hit? What information is going to come over to the system
Yeah.
so that you can know and relate back to those orders, if you will, or the change orders.
Yeah. The source of truth, you think about it in construction companies, the PMs have a different truth versus accountants.
Yes.
It's kind of so strange.
Yeah, right. And there's part of the problem, right? They're the PMs, they're a little bit, I don't want to use that, alienated might be strong, but sometimes they're the ones grappling with the tools to try and get the information they need and the requirements so they can get their WIP report or whatever reporting they have to do. And
Mhm.
they become the ones that end up doing the workarounds and start building those silos because that the accounting system just isn't giving them what they want, so they're going to track everything over here. So I feel for them in ways that they sometimes their job is a little bit harder than it needs to be, I think.
Yeah. Systems are complex too, and there's so many vendors, and so many of these systems don't talk to each other.
But yeah, right. That's truth. Yeah.
What's the real cost of a failed implementation that CFOs don't fully appreciate?
Yeah. That there's a drag on the system. There's an organizational drag when the system isn't implemented right. And that cost is revealed in ways of productivity issues, poor judgment and decisions based on wrong information, delayed decisions based on missing information. It isn't so much the cost of the system, although some of those can be kind of crazy too, but are you optimizing? Are you using it to its fullest potential? So that, I think, is an area companies could
Yeah,
definitely look
actually, one thing I have actually observed in the last 3, 4 years, some of these consulting companies in construction, they're also very far behind
at.
in their processes. They show up with like these inefficient processes, and the stuff that needs to be taking 10 hours, it takes 100 hours to do.
Yeah. And no one questions that enough, or some do, but then the response sometimes internally is like, well, we've always been doing it this way. So this is our
Yeah,
process. So yeah. Yeah. Change is hard,
yeah.
takes time.
And and you and I both know the software world has changed a lot, and a lot of these companies. I'm not necessarily talking about construction companies. I'm talking about construction software consultancy from companies. They have not changed their processes. You know,
You think that their software is not as aligned with those processes too? Is that,
so I'm thinking about companies who are migrating, let's say, these construction companies to from one ERP to another ERP.
I
I mean,
guess,
their processes are pretty bad too. Like things take like 6 months to do.
yeah,
I mean, these migrations are so painful. Like, there's one reason the construction companies are stuck in 90s is because these migrations are painful, and the consultancy companies have not, evolved, and they're like just as far behind as construction companies themselves.
you're right. That's a good point. The migrations, and I've worked a few of those. They're brutal. They do take time, and they can slip 6 months or longer, and sometimes you're still doing cleanup after the fact. When you're done.
The next section is WIP and financial truth. This is your strongest section. You've spent the last decade focused on WIP. Why is it still such a persistent problem?
WIP is the kind of process that sits between all of the data, the system, and the process. That one revealed when the WIP is hard, that means you have problems in other places. So it's not really a math problem. It's an alignment problem. You don't have your process aligned to produce the WIP easily. I think that's what I've seen to be the biggest struggle.
Yeah, it's just a lot of judgment calls in there too in WIP. It's not necessarily like a past report. It's also looking at the future.
That's right. And that note too, it's what's important is the quality of the information that WIP is going to produce, because that is kind of related to the quality of the decision you're going to be able to make. And I don't know if enough is given to that, enough credence is given to the importance of that, what it takes to get that WIP report together. So the information isn't what you're scrambling, like, okay, we finally got the WIP done. Now we can move on to our next task, because it's the exercise is about understanding where everything is, where are the projects, what is the health of all of this together, what's our cash flow look like, what's our backlog like. So there's a lot of pieces that come together, and there's a lot of important pieces that matter when it comes to the whip, in that whole process.
I had a speaker previously on the podcast, and she said WIP is one of the three main reports, and she called WIP as one report to rule them all.
I think I would agree with that. That's true.
Where does WIP usually break? Data quality, process, or ownership?
I think it you can start with ownership on that because that kind of trickles down from there. Going back to, who owns what information and is there consistency in that information being collected, disseminated, reported on. So I think I've seen a lot of that. I run into people who's supposed to enter in these change orders or, where's that purchase order that I had given, did anybody enter that in? Things like that. So there's a big scramble come if you're doing it on a monthly basis. I've been involved in those situations and there's just a lot of people trying to figure out what's going on in that moment.
Yeah. Ownership's kind of very important. Who owns the project?
Right. I think, that you should work that out internally, who's going to own that process, and this should be very clear that
Yeah.
where that trail is, what is the chain of command, if you will, for getting to that ultimate, you know, production of the win.
Yeah. And even the project management system, you think about it, like they're recording the history, they're not like real time systems. Accounting systems, let's say they're like reporting archives, but like even management systems, they're not real time systems.
Yeah. They are information systems, right? They storing information, and the goal of that too is you want to produce actionable information and reports. That's the systems are there to support all of the efforts and work that you're doing in the hope that now that you've collected all that data, you're going to be able to make some good decisions based on that.
Yeah. How do multiple quote unquote source of truth, let's say ERP versus PM tools, distort financial decision making?
Think they distort through the multiple processes. It's an alignment issue again, going back to do we have our process right? And you can have multiple sources of information, those multiple sources of truth that somebody has an Excel spreadsheet here or something there, but that just really is a symptom of the problem that they don't have a consistent process in place and they don't have a communication going and ownership in place to make all that happen.
Alignment is such a big deal. Even in AI, this Anthropic CEO, Dario Amadei, he keeps calling about alignment of AI with what the real world needs.
Yeah. Yeah, and on that too, it's the alignment because AI is going to sit on top of all those systems, and if they're not aligned, AI is going to not really be able to fix that. It's not um, it's not the judgment piece. That's the thing that the judgment and interpretation comes from the individuals. AI is there to help you amplify that for good or for bad, really.
Yeah. What does a high functioning web process actually look like in practice?
I'd have to say, you would want to, I think the ones that I have seen and the meetings I have sat in, everyone knows that the meeting is going to happen on a particular date, for instance. So there's clear communication of when accounting is going to close and what the expectation is. Everyone has a role in terms of the reports that everybody's going to review, who's going to be in that meeting all of the time. That's a consistent piece too. And with that, you're gonna get the result of that meeting when it's consistent, well designed as far as having information available, and someone is owning and running that meeting so that it stays on track. With the goal being, again, like I said before, to make sure that um, the health of the jobs that you're working on. That's kind of the key thing is where do you stand in this month, what looks like is going to be a problem. Those are the important conversations to be able to have, at that moment.
If a CFO feels like their web is unreliable, what's the first thing they should fix?
Yeah, they have to look at that ownership and process, and go and start to build in that consistency and those guardrails, if you will, for collecting the data. You don't need a perfect data set for it. You really just need a good, well-communicated process that repeats the pattern of consistency, and this way you'll get a much better result with that too.
Yeah, it's very hard to know the absolute truth about the health of the projects. So even if you can get to like let's say 80% or 90%, I don't know what that number is, but it's good enough. But like if you're like at 10%, then that's a problem.
Yeah, the two metrics. Yeah, I mean, it's going to take a little while. I think the curve is like after 20% in, you're kind of at that point, I think, also looking at labor for the most part. Once you buy out all your materials and things like that, then you're really monitoring the project between that 20 and maybe 80, 85% before you get into closeout. That's where you're going to be able to affect things. If you're able to watch that process every month, then you're going to see things coming because your information is well presented to you, and then you can make adjustments going along. Hopefully, at least ward off any problems that might come up. The communication is really important. I've seen that work very well in these meetings with people. When they start talking about what's happening on the job site, it starts to give more context to what's happening, and it could be like, well, we had to delay shipment, or the prior subcontractor, their stuff was delivered soon. It was in our way. We had to now move that, and now we lost half a day's work or something to that effect. So in terms of that communication all across is very important.
By the way, you're also working on a software product for WIP. You want to
Yeah.
say something about that?
Yeah. I've been investing the time in really digging into this process, and this is some of the revelations I'm having and seeing. Well, even just the repeat pattern of ownership and data process and processing and whatnot. So I decided that I've worked with a couple of controllers over the years, the past 10 years, and I decided to take a shot at it, and I'm getting them close now. They'll probably be ready next month to start releasing it. But the the goal here, I really wanted to solve the problems of that gap of width, to really be able to kind of force, if you will, a process that will guide them and help them get it done in a more reactive instead of proactive way. Uh, that design work has taken a little while, just a lot of the research. I've been playing with scenarios and the like. So I'm excited about it. I'm getting kind of pumped up.
The next section is on software, ROI, and industry reality. You've questioned the ROI of some construction software. How should companies actually evaluate whether a tool is worth it?
Yeah, the products today, they're delivered with the idea that if you fully utilize this system, you're going to get an ROI on it. It will pay you back. And then if you go back, though, what's happened is because they didn't come with the right process and they struggled on their implementation, now they're looking at the software and it's not performing well for them. So the ROI isn't necessarily the product, it's about your process. Making that process tight and with accountability, then really everything just kind of flows from there. It's upstream where all the work has to happen in order to get the products and everything else to flow.
Actually, I keep going back to construction tech companies, and when a company is led by purely salespeople, the kind of product usually comes out that's not very good. The product doesn't have a soul. If the company is led by a product person, it's a different product.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I can't think of examples right now, but yes, I have seen some products that really just they promised a whole lot more than they delivered.
Yeah. Why is there such a gap between what software vendors promise and what companies experience?
Yeah, I think we touched on that a little bit too, right? I think it's a combination. There is responsibility for the customer to know their process well and then be able to evaluate systems that are out there. But I also feel that, like I said earlier, that I think the vendor can play a strong role and lead these people into defining the process instead of pulling them into an implementation and then pushing them out on the other end and say, enjoy the product. I think there's more value if there's a little time spent working with that. That's the role a vendor could play that I think would be tremendous value right now for construction. They could really use it, to be honest.
Yeah, and a lot of people who are evaluating the software, they don't do a good job of evaluating it too, like the construction, finance, or ops people.
Yeah. Yeah. But sometimes, they just getting things into the system to get them in there. And, no one's really checking on the work to see if it's being done right or optimally.
The last section here is future plus practical advice. Also, this is the last question, Emmanuel. Looking ahead 3 to 5 years with AI, integrations, and data, what actually changes in construction finance and what stays the same?
AI in 3 to 5 years is still going to need that process underneath it. So instead of creating clarity, if you add AI now before you've done your process, you're just going to get more confusion in that. So I think in 3 to 5 years, unless something changes with the way that construction companies and the vendors get these people up and running on the systems, AI is definitely going to just amplify the issues that you have. If you're a company that has a good process and a well implemented system, AI is going to really help your business a great deal. You'll be able to take uh, the information you have and then really amp it up, amplify it to the point that you can make great decisions. So I think we don't need more. There isn't more tools that are necessary. There's really just more focus on process and getting that down. And then go ahead and jump into AI after that.
Yeah, AI is, at least in our world, is changing things a lot more than, in construction, finance, or software is kind of the easiest thing to automate, and it has automated so much of software.
It's true. It's very true. And that's the miss. The construction companies need to really, I don't know how it can, I've tried to find a way to put this, but in the years that I've worked with construction companies, they've almost not, they don't know what to do with the software. They're told they need to have software and technology and they try to implement it, but I think they missed the bigger picture of how it is a tool that works for you, how you can design it, if you will, to really boost your business. I hear a lot of complaints about software and the cost and it doesn't work right, et cetera. But that isn't necessarily the software in every case. It's just got to do with the process in the background.
Yeah, also the people who are operating it, sometimes they are not knowledgeable enough. I was listening to this Anthropics engineer, and he was saying like all these agents, you will not know how to operate them unless you start thinking like agents.
Yeah.
So it's kind of weird.
Yeah, that is. The one thing, and I'm just thinking on that too, but there's a certain kind of governance or maintenance that should happen with software after the fact too, right? So once you have it, it's not, okay, it's configured, we're using it every day. There needs to be people that are subject matter experts internally, right? That they can keep the system going, make sure it stays true. I think that's another area where construction, and I think other companies as well, I think it's probably broader. They don't make that investment internally. They purchase these systems, but they're not set it and forget it. They really need to have some kind of stewardship that says, this system is working for us, something changes in the process, who's responsible for, making sure that the system is utilized optimally for that, because that's how the garbage in starts to happen. Something else comes up and then somebody makes their own judgment call, and then now you're distorting your data.
Yeah, so well said. One thing I've noticed is like these systems, they tend to have like thousands of knobs. You can turn this off, you can have this, that, and suddenly like all these knobs, you really don't know which knob to turn on and which knob to turn off, you know?
Yes, I know. I'm laughing because I sometimes wonder about that too. I'm like, somebody should have said stop a while ago. There's just too many options here.
Yeah, it's very configurable, but it's a nightmare to configure.
Exactly. And so you have to, and that is really kind of a thing that's gone on in the whole evolution of software because they were very rigid in the beginning. They were very task oriented. It was accounting, you enter in your invoices and do your checks. And now, it's so much more complex. There's so much more going on. So I don't know what train of thought there.
Yeah, yeah. So 3 to 5 years from now, how
Yeah,
would
so 3 to 5 years.
construction world look?
I think they will start to benefit from AI. Again, I still think they need to do more work in being prepared for AI, and making that effort to say, okay, let's take a hard look at our process and let's, stress test it and figure out where the problems are. And because as soon as you put in AI on top of any kind of mess you have, it's going to amplify it. And trying to roll that back and then try to fix everything, go forward, it gets to be a daunting task. Easily overwhelmed.
Good points there, Emmanuel. It was a pleasure talking to you, Emmanuel. Thank you for coming on to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Rishi.
Thanks for listening to Finance at the Job Site. If you found today's conversation valuable, share it with a teammate and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. You can listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Audible, or watch on YouTube. Just search Finance at the Job Site. Until next time, here's to building smarter, faster, and more profitable projects.